Chapter 13. The Call to the Wild. Wyoming was really warming up under the hot sun of early May. Everywhere, except in the mountains, the snow had vanished and given place to rock and earth and green things in the landscape. The Marshall Ranch boiled with activity, the center of it all being Johnny. For he had been induced to take the job of construction boss. This entailed much of the work of repairing the ranch buildings, providing dams and ditches for irrigation, and putting up fences. It meant, too, that Johnny hired the men to work on the projects, bought supplies, and paid the wages. He was busy night and day. The Marshall Ranch was undergoing a change from cattle raising to sheep herding, but doing it gradually. The cattle and horses were to have their own big fenced pasture temporarily, and the sheep, to the number of 500, were to be driven from place to place on the open prairie, with herders to manage them. In this general plan, Reddy also had an important place. In fact, it was his prowess in dealing with the predators which made raising sheep seem like a fair risk. In a number of exciting hunts, he'd accounted for a record number of 23 coyotes during the late winter and early spring. In addition, he'd treed 3 vicious bobcats, thus enabling them to be disposed of. He'd also cornered and fought the second of the mountain lion pair, and kept it at bay until Johnny and the cowboys could lasso and tie the snarling animal, and get it into a crate for shipment to a zoo. He was watchdog at the ranch, guardian of the children during their rides, and a faithful companion of Johnny on his trips to town for the payroll. Indeed, he fitted into so many of the ranch activities that he was fast becoming indispensable. There was one thing, however, which he could not be induced to do, and that was to hunt timber wolves. There seemed to be at least 5 of the big fellows in the mountains that year, and they made forays onto the ranch country, occasionally leaving the remains of a dead calf in their wake. And then they returned to their mountain fastness before daylight. This made them enemies in the eyes of the ranchers, but Reddy, while willing to trail them, never brought them to bay. Johnny tried him again and again, but it was always the same. Reddy would go on their trail quietly and in complete silence, vanish among the canyons, and not come back until that night, or the next day, generally in the best spirits and without appetite for his usual meals. Only once did he seem to have been in a fight, and that time he was badly cut up. If the black and tans were put on the trail with him, he either managed to lose them or to let them get discouraged and quit. It was all very mysterious. "If he's friendly with big wolves, I can't very well blame him," Johnny told Marshall. "But the fact that he may be hunting with a wolf pack isn't so good, and I'm going to try to find out just what he does when he loses himself in the mountains, even if the job means a trip clear over the Tetons." It was arranged the next time a fresh track was found, Marshall and he would ride into the mountains, equipped to spend the night if necessary, and would take stands in the canyons where Reddy had been seen to go most often. After they had been given a couple hours' start, one of the cowboys would put Reddy on the trail. They would carry rifles just in case they might have a chance at the wolves. The children were allowed to go part way with them. Things like this had never been part of the ranch life before the ranger came in with the hounds, and everyone was very willing to admit that he and Reddy had added a new and thrilling interest to the regular routine. Patricia and Bob had worked like slaves over their home lessons, just to be given the chance to ride with the hounds. They'd become better riders, too, and were fairly bursting with health because of the outside exercise and fresh air. Bob had grown and filled out, and Patricia, with her high color and sparkling eyes, was prettier than ever before. Small wonder that the elder Marshalls felt happy over their experiment in making the ranch a winter as well as summer home, and giving up temporarily the greater luxuries of city life in the East. The timber wolves were in everyone's thoughts during the days that followed, though no sign of them was found. It seemed as if they had somehow learned that trouble was brewing. Meanwhile, wire fences went up, and a good start was made on a canal leading down from the little creek to the flat ground which was plowed and sown with alfalfa. It was a brave attempt at making a crop. Everyone knew that the antelope, the jackrabbits, prairie dogs, and gophers would manage to eat apart, even if the cattle, sheep, and horses were kept out. But at least the deer, moose, and elk would stay in the mountains during the growing season, and the mountain sheep would not venture into the ranch country. Johnny was on horseback the greater part of each day, but in the evening he and Patricia often waded into the creek to catch trout. Patricia never tired of fishing and was just as expert as Johnny at hooking and landing the big ones that the other fishermen could not lure from the deep pools. On one of these fishing trips, the two went almost as far as the edge of the timberland and were whipping some of the swift water along the rocks when Patricia saw a gray animal resembling a police dog trot along the side of a ridge and sit down on its haunches to watch her. It was more than 100 yards away, but so plainly outlined by the reddish background that she could make quite sure it was not one of the dogs from the neighboring ranches. Soon Patricia forgot all about it. But later, when she and Johnny were trudging back to the ranch, she told him about the strange dog. Johnny stopped instantly and looked back, but by that time they were far from the ridge and could see no sign of the animal. "Sure it wasn't a coyote?" he asked sharply. "Of course I am," she replied. "It was much larger." "Have you ever seen a wolf?" "No, except, of course, for the 2 skins that are at the ranch." "Well," Johnny remarked after a pause, "you saw one today." Patricia's eyes sparkled, and she asked rather breathlessly whether they were near enough to the ranch to be safe. "You're safe," he laughed. "The wolf didn't know that your eyes were sharp enough to spot him, or he would have run a mile. I'm wondering whether he spotted any of the cattle up near the creek, or whether he was just scouting around. We'll take a look tomorrow. Probably the others were nearby, but didn't show themselves, for it isn't often that wolves are found alone. Reddy's old companion, the king, was an exception, but there aren't many like him." They talked about the wolf all day, all the way to the ranch house, and at the dinner table discussed it with the others, and the possibilities of a hunt in the morning. It was decided that at daybreak Johnny and Marshall would take the horses and ride around the ranch to look for wolf tracks before releasing the hounds. If they found fresh signs, they could take stands in the mountains, as already planned, and wait there while Reddy worked out the trail. The excitement grew until the family party separated for the night. The next morning a gentle rain was falling. Breakfast was on the table when one of the cowboys who'd been sleeping in the bunkhouse beyond the corral burst in with the news that the cattle were bellowing and making a great fuss in the direction of the foothills. After that, breakfast was forgotten. The 2 children ran to the corral to saddle the horses, while Marshall and Johnny gave the cowboy directions about taking Reddy to the place where he would be sure to pick up the wolves' trail. Soon the riders were galloping through the sagebrush toward the mountains. Regardless of the rain and the wind chill, the bellowing of the cattle growing louder as they neared the timber. Presently they rounded the butte and saw a herd of 30 or more shorthorns bunched together, and looking toward something which turned out to be the mangled carcass of a red heifer. It lay all by itself on a flat, bare piece of ground. As the horses approached, they cocked their ears and snorted. Johnny dismounted and threw the reins over his horse's head and walked to the poor heifer. He looked at the tracks in the moist earth and nodded to Marshall, then hurried back to his nervous horse. "Wolf tracks, very fresh and many of them," he said quietly. He urged his horse towards the timber. Here was the place where the children were to turn back. Among the trees the 2 galloped around the rocks and up in the direction of the Tetons. Elk paths helped them, but the going was rough and wet. Every leaf that slapped their faces seemed laden with water, and stones rolled under the hooves, and they slipped higher and higher into the mountains until the rocky walls loomed almost perpendicular, with only gloomy chasms between them. At one of these places Marshall left Johnny, and then Johnny rode to the next valley and fastened his horse in a grove of evergreens, behind a high rock which gave a view into the deep canyon. The 2 stands covered the usual route of the wolves when they invaded the ranch country, and here they would be most likely to pass on their way back. The question uppermost in Johnny's mind was whether the wolves had already gone by, or whether they had obligingly loitered and perhaps rested in the foothills after their feasting. If they'd loitered, Reddy, he hoped, would rouse them out and hurry them through one of the canyons. The watchers were taking a long chance, but one which might lead to interesting results, especially if they found out what part the hound really played when he followed the wolves. Johnny made himself as comfortable as he could on the jagged wet stone and looked into the canyon. Above him and on all sides towered the rocky peaks, around which, like fog, hung the rain clouds. For a long time he saw nothing move, and then he noticed 2 mule deer feeding on the slope in the mountain opposite. These soon lay down and were no longer visible. Then a small stone rolled loudly into the canyon and gave away the whereabouts of a mountain sheep and her lamb, which blended so perfectly with the rocky background that they were scarcely discernible as they cautiously edged around a high cliff. The lamb followed precisely in its mother's footsteps, stopping whenever she stopped, feeding whenever she did, and standing on lookout with her. A single misstep would have sent either of them rolling nearly 1,000 feet. In such a dangerous place they were safe, however, from all enemies, except man and big eagles. The ewe bore pointed, upright horns like those of a goat, but the lamb was too young to show any horns, and had to rely on its mother for protection, as well as guidance, and knowing this, kept very close to her. After studying the sheep through his binoculars, Johnny looked again into the canyon and saw something moving along the rocks. When it came more into the open, its orange and red color and white, bushy tail told plainly that it was a fox. At first it trotted up the canyon, and then suddenly stopped and crouched flat on its stomach. With the binoculars, Johnny could see that a young marmot was sitting on the very rim of her burrow, intently watching the fox. The marmot was ready to jump into the den if his enemy came a step closer, so the fox turned, crept behind a rock, then sneaked in a wide circle until he could approach unseen from the opposite direction. While the marmot was still watching the place where he had been, the fox crawled forward and made a sudden rush, and had its prey pinned down before it knew what had happened. Evidently the fox was out to secure food for his young, because he started at once down the trail, carrying the limp marmot in his jaws. He traveled only a short distance, however, when suddenly he turned and came running back. This seemed odd until other shapes appeared, and a pack of 5 big gray, sharp-nosed wolves came loping up the canyon, with none other than Reddy in the lead. At first it seemed as if the wolves were chasing the hound, and then it was plain that Reddy was the one who looked ahead and watched for danger, while the others followed almost carelessly. This seemed unbelievable, but there it was. All at once Reddy stopped, and the wolves instantly stopped behind him. They were far below the ranger, who was keeping perfectly still, but something had seemed not entirely right to the hound. His eyes searched the rocks ahead. Then, like shadows, the 6 animals literally faded in the direction that they had come. It all happened so quickly and strangely that Johnny had no chance to shoot. In fact, he'd not even raised his rifle. Minutes passed, and there was no further sign of the pack. He turned around to find a more favorable position, and got the real surprise of the day. For sitting on a rock behind him, not 20 feet away, was Reddy. He was out of breath, his mouth was open, and his tongue was lolling out, but otherwise he was trying to look just the same as usual. His keen nose had caught a very faint scent of man from the backdraft of the air, which had whirled round the canyon and descended to the floor of the valley. He had, for a moment, been enough of a wolf to lead his pack to safety, but then dog enough to report to his master. The joke was on Johnny, and he chuckled to himself as he called Reddy and patted his great shoulders. He was still more surprised when Marshall gave his version of the happenings later. Marshall, from his post on the other side of the mountain, had seen 5 wolves far down the valley. They were alone and moving slowly, in single file with frequent stops, Then something made them turn around and look back. A few moments later, Reddy came into view following their trail. When the wolves saw him, instead of running away, they bunched together and greeted him with every sign of affection. Some of them romped around him and carried on just like a bunch of puppies. They were beyond reasonably accurate rifle range, but by using binoculars, Marshall was able to see everything as if quite close. The pack consisted of one old, battle-scarred wolf, which was a female, and 4 full-grown young ones, no doubt her litter of the year before. They were all powerful creatures, fully as tall as Reddy, which would indicate that each weighed about 100 pounds. After they'd romped for a few minutes, some sound or scent seemed to scare them, for they scattered and remained for a time perfectly still, all heads turned in the same direction. It was then that Reddy took command. Running through the ring of wolves, he gathered them in his wake and started up the valley at high speed, never hesitating until he entered the canyon above which the ranger was on stand. For nearly a minute Marshall lost sight of them, and then he saw Reddy coming back. This time he was driving the wolves before him, the latter slackening their pace when he slackened his, and the whole band stopping in the valley to look back toward the canyon. Presently Reddy turned to the left and the wolves to the right, but on what strange signal Marshall could not discern. Reddy climbed the mountain to go to Johnny, and the wolves entered the heavy timber on the run and were quickly lost to view. Johnny rode to the place where Marshall had last seen the pack. The fresh, dog-like footprints were plainly visible, where the heavy animals had gone up the slope in great bounds. Reddy sniffed at the tracks, and looked knowingly in the direction they led, but would show no further interest. He acted as if he did not want to betray his friends by following them. Marshall shook his head at him but laughed, and Reddy looked up at Marshall inquiringly and then began to wag his tail. "I still like that big old fraud," chuckled Marshall. "At first I thought he was a perfect hound, but now I see he's just a human as any of us. Might as well give up and go home." But other things were to happen. The gentle rain was still falling when they returned to the prairie, and again approached the carcass of the heifer. Marshall was in the lead, and he started to see the heifer move. At least that was the way it looked. But suddenly a big wolf sprang from where he'd been crouching behind it and bounded away. Marshall jumped from his horse and tore his rifle out of the holster, but Reddy was even quicker. He bolted past like an arrow and was behind the wolf almost in the twinkling of an eye. Every hair on his back was bristling. At this turn in events, Marshall was too surprised to try to shoot, and anyway, it would have been difficult to avoid the danger of hitting the hound. Johnny had swung his horse around and started on a dead run to head the wolf off from the timber. It was a breakneck chase. The wolf, now thoroughly alarmed, was making all speed for the mountains, Reddy tearing behind him, roar after roar resounding from his chest with all the old-time fury. Presently he gained, and the wolf and he were running neck and neck, lunging at each other. Before Johnny could come anywhere near, they locked in battle and rolled head over heels in a wild scramble among the sagebrush. The wolf was the first in getting to his feet and running again, with Reddy yards behind and limping. That was the order in which they hit the timber and vanished together, leaving the men hopelessly to find a path or a game trail. At length they had to dismount and take to the forest on foot in order to follow. "I can't understand it," panted Marshall. "Why should he be friends with a pack of them and then go crazy when he saw this one? I'm afraid he's met his match this time." Johnny was worried but said nothing. There was no sound ahead of them. Johnny walked in the lead, following the spoor. They'd topped a ridge and began to scale one of the larger mountains. After nearly an hour of breathless work, they came to a nest of peaks surrounded in a treeless basin. "I see Reddy!" Johnny suddenly exclaimed and pointed. The hound was stretched out on his stomach among some rocks. There was no sign of the wolf. Johnny ran forward and knelt beside him, noting the blood on his left flank and all over his head. "Great goodness!" exclaimed Marshall when he came up. "The wolf has finished him." Johnny shook his head. "Look over there," he answered. Marshall looked. Lying on its side, quite still, was the biggest wolf that he had ever seen. A gray old male with long tusks gleaming between half-open jaws. "I still don't understand it," Marshall was saying once more, as the two men were carrying Reddy home. "I do," said Johnny, looking down at the hound, whose big eyes were turned toward his. "There was some kind of feud between those two. Perhaps it was jealousy. Don't you remember the time Reddy came to the ranch all chewed up? He and the wolf must have fought then." They trudged on in silence for some time. "He weighs a ton," at length exclaimed the perspiring Marshall. "But I'd gladly carry him to the ends of the earth if it would help the old son of a gun." End of chapter 13.